Look, I've been analyzing economic policy for over 2 decades now, and I have to tell you, what we're witnessing right now is genuinely unprecedented. Not in the hyperbolic cable news sense of the word, but in the actual measurable data-driven sense. The convergence of political, economic, and institutional crises facing this administration is something I don't think most Americans fully appreciate yet. So let me walk you through exactly what's happening, why it matters, and what the data's actually telling us. Because the numbers here, they're striking. Let's start with where we always should in economic analysis: consumer sentiment and real household impact. The Tax Foundation. And this is not a left-leaning organization. This is a center-right think tank that has historically been favorable to Republican tax policy, has calculated that Trump's tariffs amount to an average tax increase of $1,200 per American household in 2025. $1,200. And that number rises to $1,600 in 2026. Now, I want you to think about that for a moment. During the campaign, we heard endlessly about how tariffs would make America wealthy, how other countries would pay these taxes. But here's what every economist knows and what the data now confirms. Tariffs are paid by American importers who pass those costs to American consumers. This isn't theory anymore. We're watching it happen in real time. The Tax Foundation describes these tariffs as the largest tax hike since 1993. Larger than any tax increase under Obama, larger than the tax increases under George H.W. Bush. And critically, this is a tax increase that falls disproportionately on lower and middle-income households because they spend a higher percentage of their income on goods. Now, the administration's argument has been that tariff revenue will offset tax cuts, that it's a net positive for the Treasury. But here's where the math completely falls apart, and I want to be very precise about this. The Congressional Budget Office just released updated projections showing that recent rollbacks of Trump's tariff strategy have wiped out roughly $800 billion with a B in expected deficit reduction over the next decade. $800 billion gone because the administration has been forced to retreat on tariff after tariff as the economic and political pain became too severe. We saw this pattern repeatedly. Announce aggressive tariffs. Watch markets wobble. Watch prices spike. Watch political pressure build. Then quietly roll them back or grant exemptions. The result is the worst of both worlds. Enough tariffs to raise prices and create uncertainty, but not enough sustained revenue to achieve the stated fiscal goals. And speaking of prices, let me address directly what the administration has been saying about inflation, because this is where we move from policy disagreement into outright denial of economic reality. The president has repeatedly claimed that grocery prices are way down. He's said this multiple times. It is empirically demonstrably false. Bureau of Labor Statistics data, this is official government data, shows that grocery prices rose 1.4% between January and September of this year. Year over year, they're up 2.7%. The 0.6% monthly increase we saw from July to August was the largest monthly spike in grocery prices in 3 years. Ground beef, that cost $5.55 per pound in January, now costs $6.32. Coffee has gone from $7 to nearly $9 per pound, partly due to tariffs. These aren't abstractions. These are prices that real families pay at real grocery stores every single week, and yet the president stands before cameras and says prices are way down. This isn't spin. This isn't messaging. This is a fundamental disconnection from economic reality that has profound political consequences, which I'll get to shortly. Now, to be fair to the administration, and I always try to be analytically even-handed, core inflation has been relatively contained. If you strip out food and energy, the inflation rate has actually declined modestly under this administration from about 3.3% to 3%. Wages have also been outpacing inflation, which is genuinely positive. But here's the thing about economic perception. People don't experience core inflation excluding food and energy. They experience the price of milk, they experience the price of gas, they experience their electricity bill, which, by the way, is up 6.2% year over year. And this is where we see the political consequences manifesting in hard data. A Fox News poll, again, not a left-leaning outlet, found that 76% of Americans now rate the economy negatively under Trump. 76%. That's worse than the 70% who rated the economy negatively at the end of the Biden administration. Think about the significance of that finding. Trump won the 2024 election in large part because voters trusted him more on the economy. He made the economy his calling card. And now, less than a year into his term, his economic approval numbers are worse than Biden's were. By a 2-to-1 margin, voters blame Trump rather than Biden for current economic conditions, 62% to 32%. Even among Republicans, only 53% blame Biden. That's a massive erosion of what was supposed to be his greatest political strength. The Gallup organization just released comprehensive approval data, and it confirms this picture. Trump's overall job approval has fallen to 36%, the lowest of his second term. Disapproval is at 60%. But the details inside those numbers are even more telling. Among independents, the voters who decide elections approval has dropped to 25%. 25%. That's the worst rating among independents in either of his terms, going back to 2017. Even Republicans have slipped to 84% approval, the lowest of his second term. On specific economic issues, Trump is underwater on virtually everything. The economy, 36% approval. The federal budget, 31%. Healthcare policy, 30%. These aren't competitive numbers. These are political crisis numbers, and we saw this manifest in actual electoral results just weeks ago. The November 2025 off-year elections were by any objective measure a disaster for Republicans. Democrats won the Virginia governorship by double digits. They won New Jersey by double digits. A Democratic socialist won the New York mayoral race in Trump's own hometown. The president himself acknowledged this. Quote, "I don't think it was good for Republicans. I'm not sure it was good for anybody." Exit polling showed that economy and cost of living were the dominant concerns driving voters toward Democrats. This is a complete inversion of 2024, when those same concerns drove voters toward Trump. Now, the administration has blamed these losses on the government shutdown, and there's certainly some validity to that. The 43-day shutdown was the longest in American history and affected millions of Americans directly. But here's my analytical take. The shutdown and the economic discontent aren't separate phenomena. They're both symptoms of the same underlying governance dysfunction. The shutdown affected 42 million Americans who rely on SNAP benefits for food assistance. SNAP stands for Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. 670,000 federal workers were furloughed. Another 730,000 essential workers continued working without pay. The Congressional Budget Office estimated $7 billion in economic damage. And while this was happening, the president attended a Great Gatsby-themed party at Mar-a-Lago, visited 6 foreign countries, and went golfing more than half a dozen times. The optics were politically devastating. And more importantly, They reinforced a narrative that the administration is disconnected from the economic struggles of ordinary Americans. Let me turn now to the tariff legal challenges, because this represents an enormous institutional and constitutional question with massive economic implications. The Supreme Court heard oral arguments on November 5th regarding the administration's use of IEEPA, that's the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, to impose sweeping tariffs without congressional authorization. And from everything I've seen in the transcripts and legal analysis, the justices were deeply skeptical. This includes conservative justices who have historically been deferential to executive authority. The fundamental question is this: does the president have unilateral authority to impose what are effectively massive tax increases on American consumers? The Constitution says the power to tax belongs to Congress. The IEEPA statute passed in 1977 doesn't mention tariffs anywhere in its text. Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Amy Coney Barrett both pressed the Solicitor General on this point. The government's argument was that these are regulatory tariffs, not revenue-raising tariffs. But as multiple justices noted, the president himself has repeatedly boasted about how much revenue the tariffs are generating. Quote, "The tariffs are going to make us rich as hell. You cannot simultaneously argue in court that these tariffs are merely regulatory, while publicly bragging about the billions in revenue they're producing." That contradiction is at the heart of the legal challenge. If the Supreme Court strikes down the IEEPA tariffs, and based on the oral arguments that seems plausible, the economic and fiscal implications would be enormous. Through August, importers had paid nearly $89 billion in IEEPA tariffs. That money would potentially need to be refunded. The effective tariff rate would fall from around 13 to 14% to roughly 5%. On one hand, that would be good for consumers and would likely reduce inflation. On the other hand, it would blow another hole in the administration's fiscal projections and further erode the case that tariffs can fund tax cuts. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget estimates that if the IEEPA tariffs are struck down, projected deficit reduction from tariff policies would fall by about $2 trillion over 10 years. That's trillion with a T. This brings me to what I consider the central economic contradiction of this administration. The simultaneous pursuit of tax cuts and tariff-funded spending is proving mathematically incompatible with fiscal sustainability. The One Big Beautiful Bill, the administration's signature tax legislation, cost an estimated $4 to $5 trillion over 10 years. The theory was that tariffs would offset much of this cost. But with tariff revenue projections falling due to policy retreats and potential Supreme Court losses, the math simply doesn't work. We're looking at projected annual deficits of around 6.7% of GDP over the next decade if the IEEPA tariffs are struck down. GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product. The national debt would rise to 126% of GDP by 2035. These are numbers that would have been considered fiscal emergency territory just a decade ago. Now, I want to discuss something that doesn't get enough attention in mainstream economic analysis: the cryptocurrency situation and its implications for governance and corruption. A House Judiciary Committee staff report released just days ago documents that the president and his family have generated over $800 million in income from cryptocurrency ventures in just the first half of 2025. Their total crypto holdings are estimated at $11.6 billion, representing roughly 73% of the president's net worth. From a pure economic governance perspective, This creates unprecedented conflicts of interest. The administration has simultaneously dismantled crypto regulatory enforcement, terminated investigations into major crypto firms, and granted regulatory rollbacks, while the president's family profits directly from that same industry. The report documents that the administration halted or terminated federal investigations into Coinbase, Gemini, Robinhood, Ripple, Crypto.com, Uniswap, and Kraken, all firms that had either invested in Trump family crypto ventures or made political donations. This isn't about partisan politics. This is about basic governance integrity. When the people making regulatory decisions are the same people profiting from regulatory rollbacks, markets cannot function efficiently because participants cannot trust that rules are being applied fairly. And the political fallout from the Epstein file situation illustrates how these governance questions create real political fractures. What started as a campaign promise to release Jeffrey Epstein's investigative files became a major test of this administration when the Justice Department tried to suppress those files. This created an extraordinary situation where Republican members of Congress, including staunch Trump allies like Marjorie Taylor Greene, broke publicly with the president. Greene said, quote, "Watching this actually turn into a fight has ripped MAGA apart." The bill to release the files eventually passed both chambers with near unanimous support, 427 to 1, in the House after the president reversed course. But the damage to party unity was visible. Greene announced she will resign from Congress in January, explicitly citing this conflict with the president. This matters economically because political instability creates policy uncertainty, and policy uncertainty is toxic to economic planning and investment. Let's talk about what all of this means for 2026 and beyond, because the political implications have real economic consequences. The latest NPR, PBS News, Marist poll shows Democrats with a 14-point advantage on the generic congressional ballot. 14 points. That's the largest Democratic advantage since November 2017, which you'll recall preceded a 40-seat Democratic House gain in 2018. Among independents, Democrats lead by 33 points. 33. Now, polls a year out are not predictive. A lot can change, but the direction and magnitude of these numbers should concern anyone who cares about policy, stability, and continuity. Republican strategists are privately acknowledging that Democrats have a real shot at picking up 3 GOP Senate seats: North Carolina, Maine, and potentially others. GOP stands for Grand Old Party, another name for the Republican Party. In the House, the betting markets give Democrats a 70% chance of retaking the majority. Why does this matter economically? Because divided government means policy paralysis. Consider if Democrats retake the House, the remainder of Trump's legislative agenda is effectively dead. No additional tax cuts. No major spending bills. Instead, we'd likely see oversight hearings, subpoenas, and potential impeachment proceedings. Markets generally dislike uncertainty, and a lame duck presidency creates enormous uncertainty. Investment decisions get delayed, hiring slows, the economic planning horizon shortens dramatically. We saw this during the second half of Trump's first term. After Democrats won the House in 2018, the policy environment became reactive rather than proactive, and current polling suggests we may be headed for a repeat of that pattern, potentially earlier and more severely. Senator Thom Tillis, a Republican from North Carolina, put it bluntly: if we are where we are today, in the beginning of the second quarter of 2026, then I think we're in for a really rough time in November. That's a sitting Republican senator acknowledging the severity of his party's position. The economic data supports his concern. Consumer confidence is at its lowest point since May. 72% of Americans say the economy is in poor shape. Nearly 60% say lowering prices should be the president's top priority, ahead of immigration, ahead of foreign policy, ahead of everything else. And yet, the administration continues to claim that costs are way down and that inflation has been defeated. The disconnect between messaging and reality is itself economically damaging because it suggests policymakers aren't addressing the problems Americans actually face. Let me talk about the healthcare situation, because this illustrates the policy dysfunction in concrete terms. Enhanced Affordable Care Act subsidies are scheduled to expire at the end of this year. The Affordable Care Act is also known as Obamacare. More than 22 million Americans benefit from these subsidies. Without extension, many would face hefty premium increases. Some estimates suggest 30% or more for certain plans. The administration developed a proposal to address this, but it was immediately rejected by the Republican base. Conservatives called it expanding Obamacare. Rank-and-file Republicans said they learnt about the proposal from social media rather than from leadership. So now we have a situation where subsidies may expire, premiums may spike, and the administration has no viable path forward, all heading into a midterm election where healthcare is already a major issue for voters. This is policy dysfunction with real economic consequences for real families. The international economic picture adds another layer of concern. The trade war has damaged relationships with key allies. Canada and Mexico have faced 25% tariffs, despite the existing USMCA trade agreement that Trump himself negotiated in his first term. USMCA stands for United States, Mexico, Canada Agreement. European allies feel abandoned. Global public opinion of America has dropped sharply. JP Morgan's research team has revised global GDP growth projections downward to 1.4% in the fourth quarter of 2025, down from 2.1% at the start of the year. They're explicitly calling for a US recession and have noted that recessions are already expected in Canada and Mexico as a direct result of tariff policies. When your major trading partners are entering recession because of your policies, that's not winning. That's economic self-harm with collateral damage. Now, I want to be analytically fair here. There are some bright spots in the economic data. The stock market has hit multiple record highs this year. The S&P 500 is up substantially since January. For Americans with significant investment portfolios, this is genuinely positive. Manufacturing production increased in August, defying economist expectations. Some companies have announced domestic investment plans, at least partly in response to tariff pressures. And the labour markets, while cooling, hasn't collapsed. Job gains have slowed down 23% from a year ago, but we haven't seen the mass layoffs that some predicted. But here's my analytical assessment of these bright spots. They're insufficient to offset the broader picture, and they're largely invisible to ordinary Americans. Stock market gains primarily benefit the already wealthy. The top 10% of Americans own about 89% of stocks. When the president says, "Look at your 401 seconds," he's talking to a subset of Americans, and even they are watching those gains get eaten by higher grocery prices, higher electricity bills, and tariff-inflated consumer goods. The manufacturing investment announcements, meanwhile, haven't translated into significant job growth yet, and some are conditional on tariff policies that may be struck down by the Supreme Court. Let me offer what I think is the most important analytical frame for understanding this moment. Throughout his career, this president has operated on the assumption that narrative can override reality. If you say something confidently enough, frequently enough, people will believe it regardless of what the data shows. This works in certain domains. It works in entertainment. It works to a degree in politics and branding, but it doesn't work in economics. Not for long anyway. You cannot talk your way out of high grocery prices. You cannot tweet away the reality of expired SNAP benefits during a shutdown. You cannot convince struggling families that they're actually thriving when they're choosing between medication and rent. Economic reality has a way of asserting itself, and we're watching that happen in real time, reflected in poll numbers, election results, and the daily decisions of millions of American households. The question now is whether there's a path to recovery for this administration's economic credibility. In theory, yes. Inflation could moderate further. The Supreme Court could surprise observers and uphold the tariffs. Trade deals could materialize that justify the pain of the trade war. Healthcare costs could stabilize. But the window is narrowing. We're now less than a year from the 2026 midterms. The patterns of economic perception are hardening, and the administration's credibility on economic issues has been damaged by months of false claims about prices that every American can see are false when they go to the store. Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is hardly a Trump critic, said it directly. Gaslighting the people and trying to tell them that prices have come down is not helping. It's actually infuriating people. When your most loyal supporters are calling your economic messaging gaslighting, you have a communication problem that compounds your policy problem. Let me close with some broader observations about what this moment means for economic governance in America. We're watching a real-time experiment in whether tariffs can serve as a substitute for traditional tax policy. The answer so far is no, at least not at this scale, and not implemented this way. We're watching a test of whether executive authority can override congressional power on fundamental questions of taxation and trade. The Supreme Court will render judgment, but the legal uncertainty has already imposed economic costs. We're watching whether cryptocurrency can become a vehicle for unprecedented presidential self-enrichment. The numbers suggest it already has, and the governance implications are profound. And we're watching whether economic reality eventually catches up with political narrative. History suggests it always does.